In David Lean's classic melodrama Brief Encounter, sequences with little or no dialogue are usually padded by the soundtrack, either with the dominant noise or subjective voiceover narration.
As we walked through the station, I remember thinking, this is the last time with Alec.
But most often, the musical score tells me what the characters are feeling. And that's also how Lean's superficially similar melodrama The Passionate Friend seems to work. Sound effect, voiceover,
I remember thinking that it was the first real hot
music. So when I see something like this, I expect the soundtrack to give me a hint about the character's emotions. But all we get is silence. And that's when things get interesting.
You mind waiting a moment, sir?
Before we explore the impact of silence as a storytelling device, let's have a look at the basic conflict. The Passionate Friends is about a woman who is torn between a passionate lover and a reasonably convenient husband.
Hallelujah.
At first glance, Richard Addinsell's orchestral score accompanies Mary's introspection and her love affair with Stephen in a rather conventional way. More than once, it links them over space and time.
Oh, Happy New Year.
In the presence of her husband Howard, however, there is no score. It only sets in when Mary thinks of Stephen. So does this tell us that the relationship between Mary and Howard is devoid of emotion? Or is it because Howard is less comfortable expressing emotions than Stephen? After the party, Stephen walks home among other people.
He's a banker, high finance and that sort of thing. He's terribly rich, too.
While Howard and Mary leave in their car, acoustically isolated from the surrounding noises.
Following day. Be warm enough. Go.
Yes, thank you, Howard.
Generally, Stephen is associated with nature and windows that show the outside world.
No.
While in Howard's house, curtains and camera angles prevent us from seeing through windows. So it seems only natural that we don't hear exterior noises either. Compared to the party they are coming from, this scene feels downright silent. Even though we hear all the sounds we could expect to hear upon entering an empty house. Yet, the mere fact that we can hear the rustle of Mary's gown and Howard laying down a hat so crisply indicates that it must be really quiet in here. And when no one moves, we often hear nothing at all. Sometimes, silence draws our attention to the lush quality of an unassuming noise. Just listen to these complex sensual sound effects. When a breath of fresh air breaks the isolation in Howard's house. In other moments, the wind is silent, so that we hear the sound of the boat off screen. But how does the silence affect us? And how do the characters handle it? Let's start with Howard, who likes to be in control.
One should never let the enemy know when he's being observed.
He does everything with a sense of purpose. He doesn't just put down a hat absent-mindedly. Even insignificant actions feel like statements.
Yes, that will do.
Using the props at hand, he deliberately punctuates his words with carefully timed sounds.
As a matter of fact, I didn't. And please don't put any more calls through. Although you almost persuaded her that it was.
Without these acoustical accents, the dialogue feels less rhythmic.
As a matter of fact, I didn't. And please don't put any more calls through. Although you almost persuaded her that it was.
If these acoustic statements are Howard's way of expressing his emotions,
Let's see.
then how does the film communicate Howard's emotions when he tries to suppress them? When he finds 2 theater tickets and thus suspects that Mary's having an affair with Stephen, Howard's struggle to dictate a letter reveals his growing unrest.
He explained that since other means have been found of stabilizing internal price levels, the effect of the natural market had been largely neutralized. Throughout this conversation with him, I had the impression that his earlier protestations have been quite insincere.
The awkward pauses have an increasingly suffocating effect on me, and I'm beginning to wish for music to bridge these uncomfortable silences.
I think I'll go on with this in the morning, Miss Layton.
And that's exactly how Mary reacts when Howard set the trap for the secret lovers.
Should we have some music?
Help yourself to a cigarette, Stephen.
To counter the mounting tension, Mary turns on some background music. But after some strange small talk, Howard turns it off with a loud click, creating a dramatic pause. Before he drops the bomb.
You know, Stratton, it's quite a shock to find that your wife's in love with another man.
Naturally, this is a turning point for Stephen too. After keeping his emotions at bay for the whole conversation, they finally burst out when he's on his own.
Well,
Not in his gestures, but only in the music. And with that, the score no longer accompanies the relationship between Mary and Stephen. So when he gets her letter the next morning, as we've already heard, there's only silence. Had it sounded like this? We'd sense that the letter was probably unpleasant. And with this music, it could have been from Mary reaffirming her love. But without the music and no glimpse of what the letter says, we're left with Stephen's ambiguous reaction. After a confrontation with Howard, this silent uncertainty recurs. Waiting for Mary, Stephen is so tense that he reacts to the faintest sounds in Howard's office. Had this been the moment when Mary returned to Stephen for good, it might have sounded something like this. In fact, with the right kind of music, the film could end then and there.
I tried to speak to you on the telephone. They wouldn't let me.
But no, we're only halfway through the film, and everything rests in abeyance, because Mary breaks up with him. Here, the absence of music does not convey ambivalence, but painful disenchantment. If I add that ending cue right here, it sounds like an expression of Stephen's feelings. However, with the same piece of music starting later, it feels as if I'm experiencing the scene from Mary's point of view, allowing me to wallow in her sadness and self-pity. But as we've seen, the filmmakers deny us such sentimental participation and relief. Hearing only Mary's crying, the emptiness of this anticlimactic moment feels even more heartbreaking to me.
That was 9 years ago.
Yet 9 years later, a chance meeting on a holiday brings back extra diegetic music. After assuming that Mary still has an affair with Stephen, Howard's repressed emotions finally manifest themselves in a familiar musical eruption. But why break the pattern here and have music express Howard's emotions as well? Maybe it has to do with this later revelation.
There was one thing I didn't bargain for in our relationship. I fell in love with you.
Like with Stephen before, this musical outburst is followed by silence between Mary and Howard. Because we want Mary to correct Howard's assumption, their inability to talk feels even more agonizing. While this silence felt tense because Howard's assumptions were true, this time it's tense because they are not.
Howard.
Yet Howard is still in control.
Your
Back in London, however, he finally loses his temper.
Now get out!
Unable to face Mary, he's not even aware that he makes his most intimate confession
I fell in love with you.
to an empty chair. Ironically, the silence feels most poignant when Howard, of all people, has to endure it. Having lost both men, Mary numbly descends into the tube to put an end to everything. And that's where a comparison with Brief Encounter seems inevitable. In one earlier scene, Mary's emotions were already accompanied by off-screen railway sounds, in the same style as in Brief Encounter. But in the climactic suicide attempts, the sound is handled rather differently. While the highly selective soundtrack of Brief Encounter creates tension by suggesting subjective perception, in The Passionate Friends, the sonic environment feels objective and calm, ostensibly indifferent even. There are a few crucial differences between these suicide attempts. In Brief Encounter, it's clearly a spur-of-the-moment response. It's also part of a subjective flashback and clarified by voiceover narration.
I meant to do it, Fred. I really meant to do it.
At this point in Mary's story, however, we are already past flashbacks and voiceover narration. We can only guess what's going on inside her head. But more importantly, Mary's suicide attempt seems premeditated, an idea she's already tinkered with in this earlier scene where we actually see her think. Apart from feelings, in contrast to Brief Encounter, here, ideas about love and belonging are actually discussed.
Our marriage has been very successful until now. It's based on freedom and understanding and a very deep affection. It's the marriage Mary and I both wanted. Your love is the romantic kind. The kind that makes big demands. Nearness, belonging, fulfillment, and priority over everything else. That isn't the kind Mary really wants.
But it's a cold, bloodless banker's point of view, and I don't believe a word of it.
Unfortunately, Mary's more modern idea of love and freedom is equally devalued,
Stephen, I want to belong to myself.
Then your life will be a failure.
presented rather hysterically,
But why can't there be love without this clutching and this gripping? This...
and ultimately dismissed when Howard rescues her on the platform. But still, the filmmakers dwell on Mary's assessment of the situation. And this focus on thinking rather than feeling might in fact be the key to the silence in The Passionate Friends. In many of these silent scenes, we witness people assessing a situation without the musical interpretation of their feelings. Here, the soundtrack emphasizes that everything just goes on in a normal, indifferent way. And this silence makes me wonder whether Mary thinks that Howard had saved her or bereaved her of her last bit of agency. Without a musical hint or voiceover narration, we'll never know. But why were the filmmakers reluctant
If you want
to fully embrace Mary's perspective? And is it even Mary's story? Or was it about Howard all along? Was all of this intentional, or rather due to the film's notoriously troubled adaptation process? It doesn't really matter. What matters, however, is that the resulting ambiguity is exactly What makes these silent moments so intriguing to me?